Hello friends! With the Procreate 5.4 update, there are now even more incredible default brushes to choose from, and we're going to explore some of them. In this video, I'm going to try Boronia. To find this brush, open the Procreate brush library, go to the Gouache set, and Boronia is third on the list. I haven't made any changes in the brush studio, and I'll be using the brush exactly as it was installed. And I have my canvas set to 4000 by 3000 pixels at 300 dpi. Before we dive in, I'd love if you'd like, comment, subscribe, and watch till the end because it really helps the channel. All right, let's first take a look at the brush behaviors. I'm going to test the strokes at different sizes. At the smallest size, the stroke seems nice and smooth, not much to see there. At a medium size, there's a bit of a dry brush texture here, and we start to see some value shifting. See, this gets a little darker here, and then here it's a little lighter. And the color is much more dense towards the bottom of the stroke. I'm guessing that has a lot to do with the pressure sensitivity of this brush. We'll test that in a second to confirm. At the largest stroke size, it starts to look more like diluted paint. You can see subtle lines in the texture which look like brush strokes. And again, there's some obvious value shifting. All right, now let's go ahead and look at that pressure sensitivity. And yes, you can definitely see that the stroke size increases with pressure and the color also shifts to a darker value. Now, when you look at the brush preview image, it shows that there's a slight taper, but it doesn't come to a clean point on both ends. It's a little rough at the beginning of the stroke, and then it tapers off a bit more smoothly at the end of the stroke. If I switch my grip and use the side of the pencil tip, it'll give the look of a light wash, but although it looks more watered down, that dry brush texture still comes through in some areas. That's kind of interesting. Traditional gouache is a mostly opaque medium, but I've noticed that some of the digital versions in Procreate's new library range in opacity quite a bit. So let's see where this one lands. Okay, so it looks like this one is semi-opaque with just one layer of color. There is some transparency with the light blue and the pink. You can see the overlap in color there. But you can also get a really good coverage. This orange is mostly opaque with just one layer of color. You can probably get full opacity with all colors just by adding an additional layer or two. All right, now let's switch to the smudge tool in the same brush and see what that does. If I blend horizontally, it's really just pushing the color back and forth. Let's see. If I use vertical strokes, it's a slightly better blend, but it's not all that impressive, to be honest. Now, if you'd like to use the same process for testing your brushes, I made a brush testing worksheet for you, and there's a link in the description for the free download. All right, let's make some art with this brush and see how it performs. All right, immediately I can see that that rough, dry brush texture is actually quite prominent at a small size like this. But it gets much smoother when you use the brush at a larger size. You can see some overlapping with this first layer of paint, but it got fairly opaque with the second layer. I'm also quickly realizing that it's a little tricky to get clean edges with this brush. So rather than fighting it, I'm just going to go with a really loose style for this painting and not worry too much about clean lines and fine details. Now, when I did the stroke test earlier, it seemed like the small size would be very smooth, but in practice, it's actually kind of scratchy. Definitely feels like painting with a very tiny, very dry brush. All right, at a larger size, it's much smoother and more pleasant to paint with. If you like painting in a loose, expressive style, this brush lends itself to that quite well. And if you use the brush at different sizes, you can create different marks, shapes, and textures to represent what you're trying to draw. I'm actually quite liking how that's working for these florals. Instead of painting individual petals, I'm just going to use color to suggest those details. And those dry, uneven brush strokes work really well in this case. When the brush is at a larger size like this, you get the dry brush look, but it actually feels smooth to paint with, if that makes sense. It just doesn't feel as scratchy as when I was painting the thin lines for the stems. Just a few quick strokes in a different color here for added detail. See how easily those strokes get a little unruly? I'm finding that I have to consistently adjust the brush size to get it to behave the way I want it to. All right, a few more strokes of color on these leaves. And a little shadow. All right, I think I'm going to call it done there. So, final thoughts on this brush. It does many of the things you'd want a digital gouache brush to do. It gives a nice painterly look. You can get solid opaque coverage or a more watered down semi-opaque look. And the colors are really nice and vibrant. The one thing that gives me pause with this brush is that it can be challenging to control, especially at smaller sizes. For that reason, I would probably only use this brush for these kinds of loose, expressive paintings where the details aren't that important. So do you think you'd give Boronia a try? Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to see more from this brush review series, there's a link to the playlist in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.